Ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, dear members of the DGAP, welcome to all of you to our special panel this afternoon on Allied perspectives on German foreign policy after the elections. We're very happy that you have joined us for this important event. This conference is the first session of a number of events to which the DGAP will be looking at foreign policy options for a new government after the elections on September 26. The end of Angela Merkel's 16 years as German Chancellor is approaching fast. Considering the latest polls, the outcome of the election is wide open and various coalitions are possible. The spectrum of policy options is therefore quite large. DGAP wants to play a part in the formulation of these options. But before options of any sort can be worked out properly, we need to have a clearer idea where we stand and what the international community and our close partners expect from us. Hence, we're very happy that we were able to unite such a distinguished panel of foreign policy analysts from the US, from France, and from Poland this afternoon. We're particularly grateful to Sylvie Kauffmann, editor of the French daily Le Monde, for being with us. Sylvie has written about international subjects from a perspective of the various countries. She has served in Moscow, Singapore, and Washington as a foreign correspondent. Her clear-eyed analysis about German foreign policy always reflects not only a deep understanding of the subject, but also a sympathetic approach towards our country. Merci Sylvie d'être avec nous cet après-midi. I also want to thank Ivo Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs, for participating in today's debate. Ivo has had a very distinguished career as a US diplomat and security expert. He worked in Bill Clinton's White House and as an advisor to Barack Obama. From 2010 to 2013, he served as the permanent representative of the US to NATO. His think tank career included a long stay as a senior fellow at Brookings. Ivo also is a prolific writer on subjects ranging from European security and US foreign policy to global strategy. Welcome, Ivo, great to have you. Last but not least, I want to express my gratitude to Michal Baranowski, Director of the Warsaw Office of the German Marshall Fund, for participating in our panel. Michael is an astute observer of political developments in Europe and beyond. He writes and speaks extensively about NATO, transatlantic relations, and US foreign policy from a perspective of Central and Eastern Europe. So he is an ideal commentator on our subject from this part of the world. Dzień dobry, Michał, witam ciebie serdecznie. Let me thank our new dynamic director, Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, for moderating this panel. We're looking forward to what promised to be a fascinating debate on a timely subject. The floor is now yours, Cathryn. Thank you very much.
My God, all of my brilliance wasted to the mute button. So I would be none the wiser if I weren't to give the thanks back exactly to, or right away, to Rolf Nikel, Ambassador Nikel, without whom we would not have the opening of this series where we look precisely at Germany from the outside. We are exactly a month from this election, some of which have cast it as a fateful potential election for the future of Germany, for the future of German power within Europe, and then, of course, for Germany's wider relations in the world, which have become increasingly, at least pressured over the last few years with a difficult relationship with the United States, certainly in the Trump administration, and a relationship that's arguably being renegotiated with a hopeful tone, but with a couple of sobering nuances, of course, over the last 2 weeks with Afghanistan, which we'll talk about as well. A shifting relationship with the erstwhile tandem partner of France, potentially a more modern relationship, a more realist relationship. We'll talk about that as well. And then, of course, in that same constellation, if you will, a changing Weimar Triangle, changing relationship between Poland, France, and Germany. Many questions now open when the Chancellor leaves her historic role, now 16 years, leading the country, an astute, pragmatic crisis manager, but potentially And this is the question to the group. Was she a foreign policy visionary? Is the country on its way toward crafting a new understanding of foreign policy for itself in collaboration with its allies? So I am thrilled really to have this group with us. And because we are in the situation in which we find ourselves today and over the past 2 weeks, I do want to start with a couple of reflections from each of you on the relationship, or how the, let's say, the Western collaboration has manifested itself on this very pernicious question of Afghanistan. Because if it showed one thing, it showed that we remain dependent on one another. It's really a pleasure to have Ivo here for this perspective as the former US ambassador to NATO. The decision very clearly being made that we would go in together and we would go out together. But the way in which we've extricated ourselves or attempted this extraction has shown that imbalances remain not only in the transatlantic relationship, but in the relationship between Europeans and the capacity of what we can really do with one another and together. So if we'll start there, and then we'll lean into the questions about what this might mean for Germany's role going forward. But Ivo, if we could start with you, a couple of reflections on how these last 2 weeks will reflect on the integrity and functionality of the West, on the integrity and functionality of the transatlantic partnership.
Well, first, Cathryn and Rolf, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here with Michal and Sylvie, and look forward to discussion. Of course, we could spend the next hour and a half, or indeed day and a half, or week and a half, or year and a half on Afghanistan, because it's not an easy subject. First of all, of course, the incredible human tragedy that we are seeing unfolding on social media, on our televisions, is just gut-wrenching and heartbreaking, particularly for all of us who have been so involved with this country for 20 years and for many years before that. And we know that whatever happens with the evacuation, many more millions of people are going to be staying in Afghanistan and will suffer greatly in ways that are potentially unspeakable. So start there before I put on my analytical hat. I think this is all in the end about human beings. Let me make 3 observations. I mean, first, the big observation is these 2 weeks, and indeed, I think the last 6 months, or if you go back to February 2020 and the agreement between the Trump administration and the Taliban, really need to be seen within the context of the last 20 years. We have been trying in one form or another since around 2002, collectively between the United States and Europe through a NATO mission, to stabilize and transform Afghanistan into a situation where it would be self-sustaining and providing for security and preventing the reemergence of terrorist training camps and safe havens. We have singularly failed in that mission. And I think you have to start from that perspective. And it was been clear that we had failed in that mission, and that the mission wasn't going to work for at least 10 years. This is not something new. It is something that we have known all along. Second point, President Biden, Joe Biden, when he was vice president, indeed when he was a senator, made clear that he believed that. He made it clear in 2008. He made it clear when he met with Karzai just before the inauguration of himself and President Obama in January 2009. And he made it really clear in the internal debate about what to do with Afghanistan in 2009, debate that as the U.S. ambassador in NATO, I was part of. The question of whether we would go for a counterterrorism or a counterinsurgency strategy. And Biden made very clear that counterinsurgency wasn't going to work because the government was too corrupt, because the idea of a centralized Afghan government in a tribal societal Afghanistan was not going to work. And so no one should have been surprised that when he became president, he was going to execute the strategy that he had embraced in 2009 and projected ever since, including during the campaign. So the question then, lastly, is on implementation. So the big issue, I think, strategically should have been unsurprising, and indeed was already foreseen in last year when the Trump administration made the terrible agreement, but they made an agreement with the Taliban. Execution, and here there are two problems with the execution. One, clearly one that is befitting to our subject here. There wasn't sufficient. In fact, there wasn't the kind of consultation one would have expected from a Biden administration and the team that it provided. And that was true for the decision in April, and it's been true ever since. And it is, history will have to figure out why that happened. We have the most transatlantic president since at least George H.W. Bush. We have the most transatlantic Secretary of State since, I don't know when, Madeleine Albright, presumably, but other than Albright, probably never. And yet there was a failure to communicate in the ways that what would have expected. For me, as surprising as I think for everybody else. And the second, of course, was that the execution of the actual withdrawal, frankly, was based on best case planning assumptions rather than worst case assumptions. And one would expect a seasoned team like this administration and the people in the government to have done a better job on that. And we're living with the consequences. Not that any withdrawal would have been easy. They would all, as Biden, I think rightly has said, been chaotic. But it is far more chaotic when you're trying to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people when you no longer own the ground and the air than when you do it when you do own the ground and the air, which we did until very recently.
Right. To bring this back to the European circumstance, or where do we go from here? Sylvie, you opened one of your recent op-eds by redefining the word debacle in the European context, but then also, and shifting now slowly to the main perspective of, or the main topic of our discussion today, Germany in that lead role effectively in Afghanistan with this large footprint. What does this mean for just the Afghanistan piece, but how is this going to influence the way that Europeans or Germans, and we're asking you to speculate, I understand that because of course your perspective is French, will think about these kind of missions in the future, and potentially again their dependency relationship or the relationship, the weight they hold in the transatlantic relationship?
Yes, well, these are big, huge questions that are raised through this debacle or debacle in English, which, I hope doesn't equate yet to a total defeat. The next weeks and months will tell what exactly is the extent of this debacle and whether it is a total defeat. But what, we see that it's a wake-up call for the Europeans, for some Europeans in particular, namely the British and the Germans, I understand, as I said. But what is strange is that they needed this wake-up call because, the dependency, the military dependency of the Europeans on America is not a hidden secret. I mean, this is the way NATO has been functioning. So there may have been misreading of Joe Biden's foreign policy. I think maybe the Europeans were so relieved and so glad and so happy to have Joe Biden after Donald Trump that they believed that things would go back or would be totally different. But they are waking up to, strangely, again, waking up because they should have known better, and the signs were there all to be seen, to an America which still works in a nicer way, may I say, along the lines of America first. Now, I was talking about the British and the Germans because, of course, they have been the most vocal about this over the past couple of weeks. The French are notably silent and are trying to avoid this I told you so line or to push this strategic autonomy concept. I think there are two reasons for that. First, they have left Afghanistan in 2014, so they are not so, even though they are involved in the evacuation operations, they were not on the ground in Afghanistan as part of the NATO forces. And the other reason is Mali. And I think the French know very well that they need to work with the American military in this kind of operation. I mean, the French are in Sahel with other European forces and trying hard to increase the number of European contingents. But they know that without the support of American intelligence and American equipment, it would be almost impossible to conduct this kind of counterterrorism operations in Sahel. So I think this current crisis in Afghanistan is raising two major questions in a way. The first one is about NATO and the transatlantic alliance, and you mentioned the strategic concept, the work which has been launched after the famous brain dead slogan of Emmanuel Macron. So we'll see whether it has an impact on this reflection, and what is the effect actually what is the actual effect that these doubts raised by the British and the Germans have, on does it have concrete consequences on the way they see the future and the capacity to act, to use another well-known expression now. And the second big question, of course, is the future of foreign interventions, and you raised it. It is an immense question. It is a very important question. I don't think we can. It is, of course, too early to try to answer, but nation building has been a disgraced concept for some time now already. But I don't think the Europeans are totally ready to give up on all this. And whether there are all kinds of possible foreign interventions, but I think we'll see probably a divide between Europeans and Americans on this big question.
Michael, can I pick up on those last points, and then we'll switch to focusing on Germany proper. But this divide that the last few weeks have exposed. I mean, we've had these divisions in the debate on whether, Sylvie put her finger on it, however we define it, whether it's the capacity to act or some version of European sovereignty and defense matters and matters beyond that fit into the defense puzzle. But what will this do you think, to the inter-European discussion, as to extrapolate from what Sylvie says? Is this an opportunity to really push the European narrative, or is this first and foremost a cataclysmic exposure of the fact that we haven't fully closed rank with the Americans, no matter how much we have invested in PESCO-EU collaboration and EU-NATO collaboration, PESCO-NATO collaboration in the last couple of years to try to close those gaps?
Thank you, Cathryn, for this great question, and it's wonderful to be with you and Sylvie and Ivo, and thank you, Rolf, for pulling us all together. Afghanistan is, of course, story number 1, 2, and 3 also in Poland, and a lot of it's focused still very much on the sort of current events. But I think we are right to ask these big questions that are being asked in Poland, and I think you asked, Cathryn, how it's going to impact European views. And I think we again will have a different part of Europe drawing a slightly different conclusion. Poland and some other aspects, some other parts of Central and Eastern Europe are, of course, deeply shaken by what we are seeing on TV happening in Kabul, but for slightly different reasons, I think. One is certainly than what Ivo and Sylvie mentioned. One has to do with what Ivo said about the lack of consultation. This is certainly, but from Polish perspective, yet another example, frankly, that the Biden administration has not consulted closely enough. It follows disappointment when it comes to the conversation between President Biden and Putin, but it also has to do with Nord Stream 2, which I know we'll come back to, but as many policy discussions in Poland, they all connect to Nord Stream 2 in one way or another, as Rolf knows very, very well. But the other thing is actually much bigger, which is credibility of US, credibility of the alliance, and therefore what Europe should do about it. And, and I think here there is a vibrant debate, and I think we need to be very careful what lessons we do draw, but also what lessons we don't draw from the Afghanistan debacle. There are some in Poland, and I would say arguably a little bit more on the right side of the political spectrum, maybe even high up in the government, that equate the commitment of US to Afghanistan and Afghan government, or at least see deep parallels to American commitment to NATO. And that would be, of course, a shock because we need US so very much. And others are a little bit more cautious about going as far, but it certainly makes a scratch on credibility and view or perception of the US. But then I think your question is also, are we now ready as Europeans to come together and provide greater autonomy, sovereignty? And I would say right now still, the difficult situation that we find ourselves in Central and Eastern Europe, it's that the answer to this one is, yes, we see this as a wake-up call, but what now? What do we do? Is it going to be enough? It's not going to be enough. Or even if we come together, we worry that will not be enough. And if you put a question mark over US credibility, and you are, for the moment, have still a big question mark over European part of NATO credibility, then you find yourself in a pretty dire situation. So this is where we are right now, and it's not a one answer. We are still in the summer, and the debates have just started. But this is the directions in which we are thinking through this right now in Warsaw. I'll stop. Thanks.
I think that's a good bridge to why we're gathered here today, which is to say, how should Germany think about its role in Europe, its role in the transatlantic relationship, and how much power can it wield? The Afghanistan question crashed into what was a relatively sleepy election campaign with great furor. And what we saw is that a great blame game began on the German political stage, but that won't move the country forward after these 16 years of Merkel. And these critical reflections on Germany's leadership, I always think of Peter Katzenstein's book, Tamed Power in Europe, and clearly a tamed power will not be able to answer the questions that all three of you have eloquently mapped out. So as we think about specifically Germany, regardless of who takes the helm after the September election, in these large questions, if we think about leadership in Europe, if we think about an ability to partner effectively and to play a different role within NATO potentially, what role should Germany play in setting a foreign and defense policy agenda for Europe and for Europe in concert with NATO, Ivo?
So when I left as ambassador in 2013, like all ambassadors, you write your last cable back to headquarters and say, here's my big thought, which usually gets buried and nobody looks at it. And in my case, that certainly was the case. But one of the big thoughts that I had, which wasn't too surprising, but maybe it wasn't such a big thought, and therefore it got buried, was the United States really needed to approach its relationship with the Europeans within NATO in a different way. In many ways, the United States continue to look at the UK as its sort of primus inter pares interlocutor when it came to NATO. And although the US would deny a special relationship, or at least would only say it was a special relationship because the Brits felt it was so important to say that it was a special relationship, at the same time, London was the first call before Berlin or Paris. Although Berlin and Paris would be called too, London was the first call. And I said that we got to change. You got to have a relationship where Berlin and Germany is primus inter pares. You need to find a way to entice Germany to start to pull its own weight. That there were good reasons why this was immediately after the 2013 election, that there might be an opportunity to do this. Germany had shown in Afghanistan where it had stepped up, and at the same time that all the other allies had stepped down. And I think Sylvie was very important to underscore this. A lot of allies had left. The French had left completely. The Brits, the Canadians, and the Dutch had stopped combat operations in 2010 when there was a lot of combat to be done. And the Germans had stepped up, and the Italians, but particularly the Germans, became the second largest contributor. So let's use that opportunity in order to drive the process forward within NATO. I also think and think today that if you're going to have a European response to this crisis, and I look at this crisis as just a continuation of what we saw from 17 to 21, doubts about the consequences for the ability of Europeans to act strategically as long as they are dependent, to the extent they are dependent, and France is, including France, continues to be dependent on the United States, that you need to build those capabilities. And the only one who can force that argument are the Germans. If the Germans were to actually increase defense spending to a level that normal countries spent on defense, given the strategic circumstances of the situation, Germany would be a military, the biggest military power in Europe, by far. And therefore would be able to bring others along, because the Germans are saying, you know, we're doing it, you need to do it too. Instead, what has happened and continues to happen is that Germany is not a leader in this. In fact, it is a leader in building excuses for not doing what is necessary, enabling everybody else to do the same. And so I think this debate that we're seeing in Europe is a healthy debate, but it's only a healthy debate if Germany takes the lead in responding to it. Mm-hmm. And if Germany does not, then it doesn't really matter what Paris does. And frankly, given the relationship between Britain and the European Union and all the difficulties that Britain will have itself to even keep the United Kingdom united itself, a whole different set of issues, nothing's going to happen. So I do think that Germany is the linchpin. I've thought that for a long time. I think this election, you know, not without getting into which party does what, the outcome of this election has to be a Germany that is willing to lead within Europe. And by leading, doing more in every possibility, and frankly, think a little less about its own national interest and a little more about its European interest.
That was a very provocative point there, Ivo. If Germany doesn't lead, then France isn't going to matter. Sylvie, I imagine you have a view on that, but it is true that we might face a situation where the Germans go through an election, they then go through a difficult coalition finding process. The world around it does not sleep. We saw that with Afghanistan, but you know, there are strategic, shall we say, challengers at the gates of Europe who are thinking about how they might use this interregnum as something that could be of benefit to them. I'm thinking specifically of China and Russia. And then we pass the baton to France, which is traditionally also focused on itself during an election campaign. So if you think about France's desires, demands, expectations for Germany, for this election, for the 4 weeks ahead, what's foremost on your list?
Well, to follow up on what Ivo just said, which is extremely interesting and constructive, I would say, it is true that the French at the moment are looking at this debate, which is, I think, starting in Germany, but with big questions. Like Michal said earlier, there's a wake-up call, and now what? So that's why we are watching what's going on in Germany and whether this Afghanistan crisis has takes off in the campaign in Germany, because at the heart of it there is this question whether Germany wants. You remember that Chancellor Merkel, when Trump was elected, said, now it's we have to take our fate in our hands. But she didn't do it, right? I mean, everybody was extremely admirative at her candor at that time, and even her lucidity or even her courage. But, she didn't follow up with action. So is this the episode which will take the Germans to have a real deep conversation about what they want to be in the world and what they want to be in Europe? I don't know. It's up to you to decide. But we are extremely interested in this looking at listening at what's going on. The same with the British, but the British are involved in their own Brexit, post-Brexit and global Britain debate. So this is a different story, though it is, of course, a factor also in this possible evolution that we may face. There is, of course, I agree that Germany is the central element because it is the central power, and what we have seen over, in fact, the past 10, 15 years and during the Angela Merkel's 4 terms is Germany being now firmly and deeply anchored in Europe as the central power in Europe. And we can see also that both interests of Germany and of the European Union are now so closely intertwined and interdependent that Germany is, as you said, is central. But there is also this Eastern region, should I say, or Central European region, Poland, of course, and the Balts, and other countries which are stubbornly stuck on this dependency to the United States. So, and what will happen in Germany, of course, will be also extremely important and influential on their own evolution. So I think this is something that France is looking at, is watching with a lot of interest, but not necessarily extremely optimistic, because this debate has been going on for such a long time. So will this be the right moment this time or not? We don't know yet, but I think there's quite a doses of skepticism in France at the moment. Now, there are other expectations, of course, more on the economic front, but I don't know if you want to address this now or later.
We'll get into that, because I think we'll do a look back before we do another look forward. And of course, there are economic questions there with respect to how Germany handled the back end of the financial crisis, that stewardship, leadership, yes, no, and what situation that leaves Germany and the European Union in at this very moment, because that's all wrapped up in the legacy of the departing chancellor. Michal, that's stubbornly stuck on the transatlantic, on the relationship of the United States, Poland, and then looking to its big neighbor, Germany, and thinking about the role that Germany should play for Polish interests, or for the continual functionality of the future of the Visegrad 4, but then also the various formats that Germany has tried to be in partnership and leadership, to borrow a phrase out of a different context, but a transatlantic context nonetheless. As you're looking across the border, what are your expectations for Germany, the country, regardless of the outcome of this election, or the specific outcome specifically.
Right. And I'll come back to why we are stubbornly stuck on this transatlantic link, though arguably a little bit less at the very moment. But few quick points. One, interestingly, very few are watching right now what's going on in Germany. It's interestingly not a big topic of debate in Warsaw. Perhaps it will be in couple weeks, but Polish public is looking elsewhere. There is a lot of going on internally as well, which is partially responsible for it. We are in Poland also in the midst of yet another government crisis that might lead to earlier election, but we've been on the cusp of earlier election for a while. So this all means that there is not as much focus. But this this division internally is the point that I wanted to make when it comes to Germany, because of course it matters tremendously who you ask in Poland what they expect of Germany, because it's an issue. It became an issue, unlike many. Well, we have quite a few of those polarizing issues, but this one is definitely, strongly there between the current ruling party and the opposition, or right and the center and the left. And if you ask members or people who agree with the policies, foreign policy of the, or the foreign policy of the ruling party, I would say the honest answer would be that Germany is already too powerful. It's already too central in the EU. And now with Biden administration, even the Americans want to talk more with Germans than, for example, with us Poles, right? So there is this, I don't want to, it almost sounds funny, but it's, there is a real hesitation and pushback that has both sort of domestic flavor to it, but is deeper as well. And then if you look at the other side of the political spectrum, then you would find views that are more in what Sylvie would describe. Frankly, that the need for German leadership, the need for Germany to step up, but the question mark, is Germany finally going to do it? If Germany is such a linchpin, as Ivo pointed out, what do we do if they again don't step up? And this is actually, I will finish on this point. This is where it connects with the point why we are so stuck on transatlantic relationship, because for us, relations with Germany, with France, with the United States are also so deeply about security. So they are existential. And until we get convinced otherwise, US remains the only power that has both the capabilities and the political will to act in the region and to act as a deterrent to the biggest threat that perceive. Now, again, what we talked about in Afghanistan puts a dent in it. I'm not sure, but the answer I'm seeing from the government, from the Polish government right now, is not to turn to Germany or France, but actually, interestingly, is to turn to Turkey, Romania, and sort of go in a very different direction than you would expect, perhaps an alternative Polish government to go if there was an early election, if there was a change in power. I'll stop.
That could be
Cathryn.
Yes.
Could I just make a small point
Please do.
Because I don't want to be misunderstood by anyone.
Yeah.
So my point is, one, that if Europe is ever going to have the capacity to act strategically and necessarily autonomously, Germany has to be the leader. I do not believe that Europe needs to be or will be any less of a close dependent ally on the United States, nor do I think that the United States would be any less closely aligned with that Europe and those interests that it is. In fact, I think it will be more so. I think the problem that the United States has had is a Europe that has not been able and willing to stand up. And the more it does, the stronger that relationship will become. I do not see strong Europe as inconsistent with strong transatlanticism. I think it is an increasingly a necessary part of that. So just as to make that clear, I don't think that the conflict that Sylvie and Michal are pointing out with regard to the United States actually needs to exist.
Right. And I mean, I think that if the Secretary of State were here, we asked him again how he meant his expression about Germany and the United States being best friends, that in some ways was, parlaying a relationship forward. I think, I mean, Ivo, I would argue that somebody read that memo again and dug it out, because I think the many ways in which this administration particularly has made offers to Germany, I mean, there's so many, including the elements of the Washington Declaration that see, irrespective of the Afghanistan tumult now, that see this American relationship leaning into that relationship. And yet all three of you have found some eloquent way of saying the Germans hadn't been doing that, or were not ready, or did not prepare the country for ... And so this is the perfect way in which we can, I think, look back at these 16 years of Angela Merkel's leadership and the state of the country now, when it realizes, or if it realizes, if this electorate realizes the kind of potential responsibility it might have to take on. And of course, that idea, that phraseology of responsibility leans straight into a series of speeches that were given at the Munich Security Conference. Many of us were there in 2014 by key personalities in the German political sphere to say, this is it, we have to step up and assume this responsibility. And all three of you have said, Germany has not entirely done that. So what does that say about the foreign policy legacy of what will be Germany's longest serving chancellor? And maybe we'll do this in reverse order and start in Poland.
Well, it's true that we often remember experiences by looking at the last moments of it. And I'm trying to find a gentle way of saying this. But the last piece of Chancellor Merkel's leadership from the perspective of Poland, even irrespectively of the political divide, which we see. And there is a chunk of Polish electorate that no matter what which you would do, would be very unhappy. But I think there is actually a bit of a consensus, and this is where, unfortunately, I do have to touch the Nord Stream 2 again. But there is a consensus that Chancellor Merkel is leaving Germany not as a grown-up power, not, I think it was Ivo who pointed out that Germany needs to be less self-interested, but have a broader European interest in mind. And I think because of the last year or so, I don't think there is any, I think this is seen as an illusion that Germany is acting as a not self-interested power. And I think here Chancellor Merkel is held responsible very, very strongly. And specifically to how far she personally fought to have the Nord Stream 2 completed against the clear, indications from not only Poland but also Ukraine and US as well. And that's, it's not only that it hurts our interests and our security, okay, but it's seen as not even inconsistent, but sort of hypocritical of Germany to do this, and of Chancellor Merkel herself. So I would say, if we look at the whole 16 years, we would see the growing power and Germany stepping up so many times. But if you, unfortunately, in the Euro crisis, in the migration crisis, though there was, of course, a lot of tensions between Poland and Germany. Also, the current Polish government has a specific view on this. But actually, the last piece leaves a pretty bad feel in mouth, sort of across, and I would say surprisingly across of the political spectrum. So the expectation would be and hope that the next chancellor, whoever he or she is, would have Germany grow up as a European power, as a power that is bringing its neighbors together and is willing to step up also at the global playing field, rather than looking beyond its immediate self-interests. So that would be the hope. Thanks.
A countryman of yours, Radek Sikorski, said even in Europe's large crisis, where of course Germany stepped up and stepped to the plate. This gets to Sylvie's earlier point about the financial crisis in 2008. Of course, Germany ended up profiting from that as well, and one might argue that even that reaction was one ultimately of self-interest. But Sylvie, 16 years is a long time, and while an assessment might be similar in the way that the Chancellor has rebuffed some of the more, shall we say, creative reform ideas from this particular French president, she had a very different relationship with the French president prior to Emmanuel Macron. So if you look at the arc of this legacy, if we can put it in those terms, how does Angela Merkel leave her own country? How does she leave the relationship with the French tandem?
Well, I think, seen from Paris, her most important legacy concerns Europe. That's, I think, the area where she's acted the most positively, and Europe, 16 years after she arrived, is in a better shape. I mean, it's more united. It's bigger, of course, but it's larger. But it was already starting to get larger when she arrived. Poland and the others joined the EU in 2004, just 1 year before Angela Merkel came to power. But she is the chancellor of that Europe, which grew bigger and stronger internally. And I mean, there are various cases to be made, because if you look at the refugee crisis, for instance, 2015, which Angela Merkel is credited with, holding the moral high ground on that episode by opening Germany to those refugees. But if you look at the effect it had on Europe, it was terribly divisive. And the way Germany tried to push these repartition by quotas of refugees on Central European countries who were totally against it, had a very, very negative impact on the unity of Europe. But that's one aspect. On the other, the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis could have had also a terrible impact, and it was divisive also this time between North and South. But in a way, the COVID-19 crisis made up for it. And that's, of course, the major achievement, I think, of Angela Merkel regarding Europe. It's the way in France, we see it as a revolution for Germany, because, this was such a deeply anchored taboo, not to neutral as the debt at European level. And Macron doesn't, he tries to take credit somehow for it, partially because he initiated the move, but he reckons that it was Angela Merkel's and Germany's definitive move to be made. So, and the effort was mostly German to be accomplished. So this is a really major development. We'll see if after the election in Germany, this is a one-shot, a one-off occurrence, or as many European partners hope, it will be repeated. But that was really something extremely important. On the world scene, I think her legacy is far less clear. It's blurred in my sense. I think the way she, the last couple of weeks with her trip to Moscow and to Kiev show all the ambivalence and the ambiguity of this constant balance of Germany, between trying to establish a balance between its economic interests, which are traditionally what drive its foreign policy, and the principles, which are very, have been very, very difficult to hold. And I think that this balance will be more and more difficult. Merkel had this unique talent maybe to compromise and to navigate between all those contradictions. I don't know about whether her successor might be so talented. And I think also the world might not be so accommodating in the future for such a policy from Germany.
Ivo, these past 4 years have seen many American headlines around the Chancellor's legacy, things that she always pushed away, the fact that she was now the leader of the free world and the leader of the West, these sort of adages that, the adages that she didn't want to embrace herself, but particularly in relationship to the United States over the years, but then also, now thinking about the role that she played over these last couple of years as the great power competition began to heat up. What is her legacy in great power politics and relations to the United States?
So, that's a very big question. Let me start off with saying that I'm a firm believer that people should not be in power for longer than like 10 years because they start to atrophy. And I think had she left in 2017, her legacy would be different than it's going to be, in part for reasons that Michal and Sylvie already laid out. In terms of the sort of the large American interest, I think there are, it's a balance sheet. She clearly represents and represented and acted upon a set of values and a set of principles that are very important as foundation stones for the transatlantic relationship, most clearly expressed in the migration crisis, but also, frankly, in quietly for the last 10 years, having 5,000 troops at the beginning, but remaining the second largest contributor in Afghanistan, and that was a commitment at the time that others had fallen away, that the normal military partners of the United States had walked away from, and Germany did that with real impact on the daily lives of the people who lived in the northern part of Afghanistan, and seen in that context. So I think that's one piece. For those of us who care deeply about Europe and European cooperation, I think Sylvie's points on her contribution to the European Union, including, very importantly, the last big hurdle in which borrowing at an EU level and the COVID package that was agreed a few months ago was really very important, centrally important for the European Union to be what it is today, certainly as an economic actor, but even potentially as a political actor, more united, I think, than anybody would have expected in a post-Brexit, and even in the initial way in which COVID was addressed from a more nationalist perspective, could have expected. But, and this gets to your question, Germany remains, and she has been a leader in having a foreign policy that is essentially mercantilist, in which economic interests drive, to a large extent, what needs to happen. That's been true for policy towards Russia. Yes, she was extraordinarily important, took a leading role in the initial sanctions in 2014. And yes, she has been a leader in maintaining those sanctions within the EU context, but at the same time is consistently trying to figure out how to have an economic relationship with Russia, and Nord Stream 2 just being one element of that. And of course, on the China angle, we can, but on the China angle, it's been hard going to push a non-economic message. Okay, she's been reluctantly pulled into issues like Hong Kong, issues like Shenzhen and the Uyghurs, but it's been hard going. And I think the expectation on the US part is that that was Merkel more than anyone else, that her departure and replacement by a new leader of whatever party is likely to lead to a less mercantilist policy and a more one in which we can add other ingredients of power into the relationship. Whether that will have all of the ingredients of power that the United States would like to see, including on the military side, TBD. Depends a little bit on what the coalition government is and who leads it. But I think it is going to be less in that sense, and that we may have seen the last of the kind of mercantilist policy that Merkel, strangely in some ways, because it's not where her value structure is, but in many ways personified in a very traditional CDU kind of way.
We'll let all three of you do some reading of the tea leaves in just a moment, but this is the time now where I want to ask everybody on the call to begin putting their questions either in the chat or in the Q&A field. I have a couple already racking up, and I'll get to those in a moment. But I want to do two more rounds. One, sort of a quick round, but that leans exactly into how Ivo just sort of tapered that question off, which is to say, well, before we get to what constellations might lead then to certain outcomes that could be beneficial for either of your countries or for the West at large, what are the 5 most pressing challenges that Germany needs to address over the next 4 years within both internationally and in an inter-European context? You've already leaned into some of them, but you can just give me your top 5 without explanation, but I think that will yield some provocative further discussion. Let's start with Sylvie this time.
Sorry. 5, I can think of 3 immediately. I'll have to find those 2 more ones while I'm talking. First one, summing up the discussion we just had, what kind of power was Germany wants to be on the global scene, and for me that means with the European Union, of course. What kind of Europe does Germany want to be on? What kind of role does Germany want to have for Europe on the global scene? Will Germany adhere to the concept of Europe as a global power or not? And that means, prioritizing its own economic interest and commercial interest in a different way. The second challenge is the European economy governance. And of course, that's a big expectation in Paris. What will happen to the Stability Pact? Will it have to be renewed after, it broke into pieces, if I may say, because of the COVID crisis, but what will become of it? And also this mutual debts, will it be a one occurrence, or will it be the new way, the new system of European economic union? Maybe another challenge is how does it deal with its European partners, particularly with Central European partners? How does Germany deal with this long-standing issue now of the rule of law with Hungary and Poland? How, of course, it's an issue for all European Union members, but it's also probably a most pressing issue for Germany because of its very close relationship with Poland and Hungary. And again, we can look at this economic factor in this. So that makes four. I'm afraid I don't have a fifth one right now, but if I find it, I'll come back to you.
Ivo, we'll go to you next. Your top 3 to 5.
So I think number one is sort of a variation of Sylvie's number one, which is the relationship with the United States, whether it's a bilateral one or whether Germany conceives of that relationship as a leader of Europe. So up to now, it has been primarily a bilateral relationship. The question is it thinking about how it can transform that? And that, in fact, will, I think, have a major impact on how the United States looks at Germany and Europe. I think, secondly, just because it exists, is China. How one thinks about and acts and strategizes on the issue of China. Not because I particularly buy into the idea that China is now the only topic that matters for everybody, but China is a big player. And having a policy towards China that is strategic as opposed to just driven by economic interest is I think, going to be critical. The third is Russia, and Merkel has had a peculiarly personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, which I think in some ways has benefited Germany, Europe, and the transatlantic alliance, and in other ways has not. Is there a different relationship with Russia? Yes, Putin still is, the singular figure there, but what is that relationship? How does that relate to the work Germany is going to do with all of its allies, but also, and in particular, the allies to its east, with issues like Ukraine and others that are bound to be there. I guess the fourth question is inevitably for the next government, if we think about that government not just as a 4-year, but as a potentially a decade-long government, is Africa. Merkel talked a really good talk when it came to Africa, talking about a Marshall Plan, etc. But, as they say in the United States, where's the beef? COVID, climate change, and the normal, the evolution of the African continent, which is doubling in size in terms of populations in the next 20, 25 years, is going to be one of the great global challenges and potential opportunities for the world, but first and foremost for Europeans, because as a developed part of the world, you're closest. So those are 4, right? And I guess fifth, and I don't want to rank these, the future of democracy. Sylvie talked about Hungary and Poland, but we are all beset by forces within our own countries, including my country, the United States, that are deeply, deeply troubling. And anyone who's a student of the 20s and the 30s sees patterns that are deeply troubling. And Germany, which has a unique role and performed a unique role in thinking about how to maintain, strengthen democracy, thinking through how both it deals with its internal challenges, which are real, but more equally importantly, how it leads the effort to maintain democracy as a viable system of governance, which I do think is under challenge.
Sylvie raised her hand, shot up. I don't know if it shot up at the Africa point, which would be.
It's just I found the fifth priority.
Ah, good. Okay.
It's climate. It's so big that I forgot about it, but because it's a challenge for all of us, of course. But it's particularly for Germany as for other European countries, is how we make this transition and particularly the energy transition socially acceptable. And as we've seen in France, it is a big challenge.
Yeah. Good. Not only was that a very astute and necessary point, but it's bought Michal some time to think about his 5, so we can make it 5 or 3 to 5. I'm being very flexible this afternoon. I'm generous, I guess.
By now they are all 5. They are ranked. They are well developed. No, you know, we have a lot of course, overlap of our views here. But I would actually say the number 1 is, you know, where is Europe when it comes to the U.S. China competition? It's a little bit of a, you know, specific aspect of this. But you know, and here, if Germany, where Germany goes, Europe might have to go, with the, you know, simplifying it between Western option, United West versus some kind of equidistance third one. I mean, that's something I think that will be looking to big time. Berlin. Second one, we talked about it so much, you know, what kind of Europe we have, but in terms of integration, also in terms of economic integration, in terms of role of the institutions. I mean, we have a lot of, we have had so many crises that I feel like we haven't had fully time to digest it. And it seems like now would be a good time to digest it. Third one is where I agree with Sylvie and Ivo is frankly Poland and Hungary. And Poland in a way more so because it's more tricky, because it's bigger, it's weighs more, and it's Germany's neighbor. And you know, Rolf knows it better than most how tricky it is to play this, given that there will not be now there might be Polish developments that would sort of change the landscape, but it's a difficult case also, by the way, for the United States, and I think I don't have a very good answer. Fourth one is the Germany's relationship with autocracies that are important for it economically. And this is where I would lump China and Russia together. We talked about it. Ivo described it as a mercantilist approach. But how do you actually, you know, what drives Germany? Is it larger interests and values, or is it really the economic interest that Sylvie described? And the last one is to what extent next government in Berlin will be able to push Europe toward a real regional power. And it has an African aspect, but it has a Middle Eastern aspect. It has a Eastern European aspect as well. I mean, for Warsaw, for us, the really big glaring job to do is of course, Ukraine, but also increasingly Belarus. I mean, we are in one unstable neighborhood where we are not yet able to fully deal with all the challenges. So those would be my 5. Thanks.
Now I'm going to ask you to do something that's uniquely unfair, but that given the title of this, you may have surmised. I don't know the degree to which you've been reading the party political programs, and to a certain extent, things have really shifted. So where I think the CDU started out with a continuation of the mercantilist, if I'm going to pick up on Ivo's language, narrative, even over the last couple of weeks, despite the fact that foreign policy has been roughly absent, there have been a couple of very interesting pronouncements, not least a series of essays that were just published about a week and a half ago by senior leadership from the Christian Democratic Party that took a rethink on the China question. So if you were to read the tea leaves and now match up your 5 priorities with the possible government constellations, and you can let the polls be your guide or not, which kind of coalition could, quote unquote, very glib American, get the job done? Ivo.
Gee, I leave that to you guys, right? In some ways, but I mean, that's a cop-out. I think it is important that the coalition be different than it is today. And that it has elements in that coalition that haven't been in the coalition for a while. And I think in particular that a green participation in that coalition, I'm struck that quite apart from just the last 2 weeks, that the the main foreign policy perspectives of the Greens has tended to be more values and less economic interest driven. I think the Green participation in the only government that it ever did participate in was an extremely positive one for US-European relations. A surprisingly positive one, I think, for many of us at the time. So I think change is necessary. I made my point on how long leadership should be in power. I think change is very necessary. It just is. Everything gets stultified after 16 years, and therefore, I'd look at that.
Sylvie, do you want to? Are you a betting woman and would like to take a wager, or would you like your astute knowledge to guide your response?
Yeah, well, not only I'm not a betting woman, but I'm not an expert on German domestic politics. No, there's a lot of curiosity about the Greens, of course, in France and about their foreign policy. But this curiosity is not satisfied because I think the reading is a bit difficult. For instance, on defense, on nuclear energy, it's definitely easy to read. But there are other issues on foreign policy that we are not so sure about. So there's a lot of excitement, in fact, in France about the Greens. Of course, the CDU and the SPD are more familiar. So. We'll see, but I wouldn't, I'm totally unable to bet on what kind of coalition you'll get and what it will produce. But what we anticipate with a lot of apprehension is how long it will take to form this coalition. And you have to be reminded that the French are taking the presidency of the European Union on January 1st. And if, as the past has shown, those coalition negotiations are not over, it will overlap with the French presidency. And the fear is that, Europe, the EU will be again not paralyzed because it can, function on its own, but the initiatives will be blocked, and it will be very, that may lead to a lot of of big disappointments, because the French, of course, want to launch quite a number of things during their presidency, and not only because that's what every country wants to do, but also because there's the French presidential election.
They want to do it early. They want to get it done in January.
Yeah, it has to be done by March. Yeah. So whatever the coalition, it has to be quick.
Yeah. Michal, what do you want to set your money on something? Do you want to prognosticate? Is there something that would be particularly advantageous to the Polish circumstance, a coalition that might help the 5 challenges you've mapped out?
So interestingly, well, depending what you ask, on the 5 challenges, I think yes. On the Polish-German relationship, I actually think no matter what, it's going to be tricky or very tricky. But I think one observation is, how many combinations there are. Wow, this is fun. You can really win some money if you are a betting man. I think there's of course a lot of interest in Greens, but it's a double-edged sword in case of Poland. Because on one hand, you have the Greens who said no to Nord Stream 2 and let's be more principled toward Russia and China. But on the other hand, what's up with the values and what's going on with Poland internally? So this is going to be very interesting one. I think that some combination between the black, green, or the Jamaica sounds to hit a lot of the points that we've been talking about. Potentially, again, I think all of us here we are approaching this election in Germany with this feeling, is this moment yet here where Germany will get together, sort of re-emerge as a more real power, and then we'll see, and I would say from specifically in Warsaw, actually when that happens, there will be a reaction both ways. Some people will be very happy and some people will be very concerned. So therefore, my one sure bet is that no matter what the coalition emerges, it's going to be a tricky one for Polish-German relationship, but hopefully good for Europe and the West. That's maybe I'll stop here.
You've mapped out, all of you have mapped out the 5 challenges. You've mapped out what coalition or what grouping might be able to deliver on those 5 challenges. But I want to combine 2 questions here from our audience and from the chat, which is specific to the German population. So Ivo mentioned earlier, we talked about earlier, whether or not the previous leadership had actually prepared the German public, this idea of responsibility, to take on these 5 challenges, which is to say, is the population ready, or is one of the astute skills that Angela Merkel had to keep those kind of challenges away from the German public? And the add-on to that is my colleague Milan Nitsch asking in the chat, is there any element of surprise that you've seen in this campaigning cycle, again, that may not have resonated too far beyond German borders, on the issues on the campaign, or how the parties are addressing their own public? Why don't we go in reverse order? Michal, you get to ping pong right back.
Great. I think especially on the issue of German population and you know, it's a lot of the, and I think that's sort of the, we've been harsh perhaps a little bit on Chancellor Merkel, but I think if we are a little bit more honest and we look at a lot of the polls that Chicago Council has done, GMF, Pew, we will see sources and seeds of this hesitation to play a greater role and some of the difficult trade-offs. So this is a real issue. And then the question is whether the next chancellor can be more of a leader of this opinion. And I would just give a shout out to one, you know, very specific to one German leader that I forgot to mention in this coalition betting, but I really hope that AKK stays in the mix, because I think she is effectively, and I'm not going to vote in the German election on or meddle in them in any other way, but you know, she has shown time and again, or at least given great speeches and ways of leading. If perhaps those messages resonate a little bit deeper, we would see changes on the public level that we certainly need if we want to have the Germany that we've been talking about for the last hour or so. Thanks.
So are these German foreign policy values really lived by the public? That was the direct question that was asked in the chat. Sylvie, do you see, is there a gap between the German public and this debate going on at the political level?
Well, it's difficult for me to judge. What has surprised us is the stability also of this German system, particularly compared to ours, of course. But you know, to see that Mr. Scholz and the SPD are, you know, in the first have gained so much ground now is a huge surprise, because you know, the French Socialist Party has almost disappeared, and you know, 4 years ago, when Macron was elected, by destroying, you know, by completing the destruction of the French political landscape, there was a lot of speculation that this was going to happen in most European countries, and it did. I mean, there's a lot of disruption did happen in various European countries, but strangely, the Germans, you know, after the rise of AfD and the SPD did go down, and the CDU was weakened, and the Greens did go up, but you know, at the moment, I don't know how how much it will change in the next 4 weeks. But at the moment, it looks like a very stable political system. So this is quite impressive, I think. But I don't know whether it's good or bad, actually.
Ivo, what's your assessment? Is the German public ready for the challenges ahead? Or what has surprised you in looking at how the campaign has gone?
Is the German public ready? No, but it hasn't had a leadership that had made them ready for the last 16 years. I mean, I think the very cautiousness in which Merkel has expressed publicly and in many ways acted beyond the European sphere, where I think she has led, and she has led publicly more, particularly in the last few years than before. But on the big foreign policy issues, she hasn't led. And so it's not, in fact, she has sort of made public opinion an excuse for inaction rather than the other way around. I've spent a lot of time, and the Chicago Council spends a lot of time thinking about the relationship between public opinion and foreign policy. And public opinion puts guardrails on the possibilities of what you can do. And it's important to understand where those guardrails are. But it is also something that that can be led through engagement, and I think other countries are much better at it than Germany. I think the French government, traditionally, in part because it's a presidential system, it makes it a little easier to lead. But I do think there is a dialectic going on between the politicians and the public in a place like France that just is missing, it seems to me, in a place like Germany. I hadn't thought on the question of the campaign. I hadn't thought about Sylvie's point, but I think it's a really apt point. It's a very important point. The stability of the essential structure where you have, I mean, the Greens have been playing this game, a party political game, for 20, 30 years. So you have four parties that in many ways remain essentially the same. And in almost every other European system except for the British, although that has peculiar reasons for it, that just hasn't happened. And even in the British case, the Conservative Party today is a completely different party than it was 10 years ago. And had to be in order to gain where it is. And yet, if you ask, where do the Greens stand? Where does the FDP stand? Where does the CDU stand? Where do the SPD stand? They're pretty much the same, structure that they have been for a very, very, very long time. And that speaks well for the stability of the democracy of the country. And at a time when so many of our countries are undergoing changes that are worrisome, this campaign is showing stability, which is a good thing.
Well, it's not my job to insert myself into this, but I will say, as somebody who's just returned from the United States after 13 years, it does feel very stable. However, that can be very much a strength, Ivo, but all three of you have highlighted how that could be a potential Achilles heel going forward, because the challenges that all of you have mapped are real. They will demand not only the attention of the German public, but they will demand public resources, which the German public has, I think, yet to fully understand the degree to which they will be necessary, and the way that they will have to actively lean into these challenges to make a difference and to frankly, assume the leadership role, which all three of you have described in different ways for different functionalities. I think that the country needs to play. So either way, it's an exciting time ahead. I think it's, and I have to say this as the director of the DGAP, and I mean this earnestly, I do think there are a lot of opportunities for Germany to have really a remarkable role in certainly the next five years ahead, if it assumes and takes on the challenges that all three of you have so eloquently mapped. So before we say goodbye, I promised a softball question. We usually try to end on something that's either optimistic or, in this case, softball. So given all the things that you've said, new chancellor assumes office, he or she, and comes to office in either December or January. Where does his or her first trip take him or her? and why? Sylvie.
You may remember in 2018 when Angela Merkel was inaugurated, she hinted that she would go to Warsaw first. And the French told her, not a good idea. Not that it was a bad idea to go to Warsaw, but that would send a wrong signal to Paris and to the rest of us. So she did go to Paris. I think for a change, the new Chancellor should go to Brussels first and then take the Thalys and go to Paris, or do it the other way, fly to Paris and then take the Thalys with the French president to Brussels. And that would be a great show of, European unity led by the Franco-German tandem.
Symbolpolitik is always important, and I really am already enjoying those images in my mind. Michal.
Brussels was also #1 for me. I just still like the idea of the new Chancellor traveling to Warsaw besides Paris. Not sure if by November it's going to be the most popular choice, given the Polish politics. But I would actually, not because GMF is so focused on transatlantic relationship, but I think actually Washington has to be very quickly up there, because something we haven't fully discussed as much is, Germany and right now has just not delivered on the transatlantic relationship and partnership. And we by now are, it looked like it might not be a crisis when we are again in a crisis. So I would say Brussels, Paris, Warsaw, and then a quick flight transatlantically, all hopefully within the first 24 hours. Thanks.
That's going to be a busy man or woman. Ivo.
So I agree with Brussels. And I think if Germany really wants to demonstrate that it's different, it needs to take not the Thalys, but a direct flight to Washington from Brussels. Germany has two fundamental partners as far as we can tell, Europe and the United States. And if it is going to be that leader of Europe that we've talked about, then why go to Paris or Warsaw?
Well, as a German American, I'm going to withhold my opinion, and you can all bet on what I might say. But it is my role to thank this excellent panel for both leaning into the serious challenges and questions that we have with great clarity and reflection, as is their nature, which is why we consider them friends here at the DGAP and collaborators, but also with the requisite sense of humor that I think in these dark times we still all need and deserve, and that make us human. So thank you to all three of you for being with us. Ivo on his early Chicago morning, and then everybody else, or early-ish Chicago morning, and everybody else for joining us from the European continent. Thank you, all three of you. We'll talk more, and we'll look very closely at what the Germans decide on a potential fateful Sunday in September. So thanks all for being here. Thanks for your active participation. Thanks to this fantastic panel. Be well, be healthy, and continue to follow our work. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.